NAFI would like to thank Sporties, Avemco, and AOPA for their generous sponsorship of this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. Avemco Insurance Company is the official insurance of NAFI. Since 1961, when you call Avemco, you get real answers from real people. Nobody understands the needs of CFIs better than Avemco. So protect your career with the only insurance designed exclusively for NAFI members that comes with unique features and benefits you won't find anywhere else. To learn more, call 888-635-4306 or visit www.avemco.com/NAFI to start your quote today. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. My name is Sarah Staudt. I'm the Program Development Manager here at NAFI and your host for this podcast. This episode is a bit different than some of our other episodes. We're releasing this in Part 1 and Part 2 to cover our MOSAIC content. This is Part 2, where I'm joined by Bill Snodgrass, who is a sport flight instructor, private pilot, and ASTM voting member, who also represented NAFI during the MOSAIC rulemaking process. If you haven't listened to Part 1 already, be sure to listen to that, where I'm joined by Samantha Boyer, who also represented NAFI during the rulemaking process and is an associate professor of aeronautics at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. In this episode, we cover what we know about the new Part 22 light sport aircraft certification rules, as well as progress on the ASTM consensus standards development.
So just a little bit about myself. I am a sport pilot CFI. I'm actually, I have a private pilot certificate. I started flying in 2004, but I got a sport pilot certificate and then eventually got my sport pilot flight instructor certificate. Also went through the medical process to get a private pilot certificate. So I know a lot about the issues concerning people, working with sport pilots and private pilots. I have about 1,000 hours as a sport pilot flight instructor and over 2,000 hours as a private pilot. And I am been involved in different aviation groups like Angel Flight West and the airport we have out here, as well as EAA chapter president and Young Eagles coordinator. Lately, I'm now working with the ASTM. Used to be called the American Society for Test and Measurements, but it's now an International Standards Test and Measurement, which is the group that's working on the new Part 22 light sport aircraft. And I am a task group leader for a couple of those groups, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I've been working with light sports since 2004. I did weight shift control, and then currently I'm flying RV-12s for my flight instruction.
Oh, cool. I've got time in RV-12, so they're fun
Oh,
little
you did?
airplanes.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, I love them. They're great. So yeah, yep.
Thanks for that overview, Bill. We're glad to have you helping out NAFI. Given your experience working with ASTM, we wanted to talk to you about, and you hinted at, these new Part 22 light sport aircraft
Yes.
regulations. So a big thing MOSAIC did, as we talked about in previous segments, was to eliminate the definition of light sport aircraft.
That's correct. Yep.
In 1.1, now what is a light sport aircraft is very different than the concept of what a light sport pilot can operate. These are kind of two different schools of thought. They don't necessarily marry up directly anymore, or they won't, because the aircraft side.
They've separated them. Yep.
Yep. So the aircraft certification comes into effect in late July of 2026. And so that's another part of this rule we have to remember. We keep hearing, October 22nd is the effective date for MOSAIC. And it is for the pilots, but
Yep.
not for the definition of what's a light sport aircraft and what it's going to take to get an aircraft certificated as such.
Right. And the MOSAIC rule was announced at AirVenture 2025. July 24th with Sam Graves and Sean Duffy and Chris Richelieu and Jack Pelton, which is awesome. I got to be in the crowd and see it too, so that was amazing. And then, this got in the Federal Register. It's about 582 of the pages of preamble. But one of the things I like for people to know is even though the Federal Register of MOSAIC is really large, what is amazing is that the FAA took all of the comments And they explained why they thought those comments didn't work for the rule or why they are going to change them for the rule. And so by addressing them, you can read and get to know a little bit about why the FAA thinks this sort of change is the way they wanted to do it. It's kind of an insight into our government working, and I really like that. So, some MOSAIC changes, not all. So we're going to talk a little bit about the light sport aircraft definition was removed, just like you said, part 1.1, and that created a change. The light sport category was added, and we're going to talk about this specifically. Noise regulation was added. However, there was a relatively large pushback from the industry, and so the rule is a voluntary compliance only right now. And we all know how that's going to go, but assuming at least starting out, I mean, the truth of the matter is that most light sport aircraft today are not nearly as noisy as, like a Cessna 182, quite frankly, but or other aircraft like that. But trying to force a 182 or something to become noise compliant is going to be a difficult proposition. The FAA is working towards mandating or regulatory processes for noise, but in this first go around, they're making it voluntary. So hopefully we can come up with some better regulation later that will help everyone. Then the FAA accepts the standards from ASTM. And that's what I'm going to talk mostly about here is how we get to these standards. One of the little things that I put in here is that and we're going to talk more about this, but the FAA is accepting a consensus standard from the ASTM group on the new Part 22 aircraft that are being built. If an aircraft does not have an acceptance standard, a consensus standard accepted by the FAA, they're not going to reject it, but they don't accept it, then that aircraft would not be able to be an aircraft, at least for the United States government. It could maybe be done somewhere else, but it'd be unlikely because the other civil aviation authorities aren't going to want to do it either. So there is a rush. We are all quite in a tizzy trying to get all of the regulation, all of the standards out to the FAA, which means that we have to have them out by April of 2026 because they have to review them and vet them, and they're going to come back with things that they either will accept or will not want. And then we're going to send them back through the process, and I'll show that at the end here. This is something important to understand that we realize that we need to get these consensus standards in place, and we are on a time crunch to get them done. The Part 22 light sport category aircraft, and this presentation is airplane centric. So I'm not talking specifically about weight shift control or gyroplanes, vertical takeoff and lift, and helicopters, because there are other types of regulations that need to be adjusted for that.
It's hard to capture it all. And there's a lot that simply isn't developed yet. Like you hinted at, those simplified flight controls. What does that mean? What's that going to look like? We don't know.
I have this example in the screen here of the Aluda MK3 Speeder, which is a prototype, and there's others, right? The Joby and the Archer, and I mean, there are a lot of different types of vertical takeoff and landing, how they work and what they're going to do with them, how they're going to operate. Like I talked earlier about, for example, there's not a designated pilot examiner that knows how to give a check ride in one of these. The manufacturers are going to have to create instructors that are going to teach people how to fly them and what are the regulations for that. There's still a fair amount of information that I don't know. There are a lot of other people in this industry portion that are really working hard at this. And it's very exciting and it's a big area. It's really popular. It's exciting to see what's happening here. So we'll move on here. So the previous light sport aircraft definition, or the current one, I should say, until October 22nd, which is the new effective date for sport pilots. The previous light sport aircraft definition, part 1.1, stated maximum takeoff weight 1,320 pounds, two-seat max, stall speed 45 knots, clean, cruise or maximum speed in flight 120 knots, fixed landing gear, fixed pitch or ground adjustable prop, single engine, unpressurized cabin, airworthiness, can be flown at night. And all of the light sport aircrafts that are built to fly at night can still do that. And then moving forward, they'll still be able to do that. We also have what are called technically advanced aircraft. There are a number of light sports like the RV-12 that I fly that has, advanced avionics package with autopilot that allows you to do instrument training and get an instrument certificate in it. That will still be a possibility going forward. But this is the current definition that is going to be removed. And then as of July 24, 2026, that's the date of the change. Um, so the new FAR Part 22 light sport categories, we have what are called Part 23 aircraft. So those are Cessnas and Pipers and things like that, Cirrus, et cetera. There's now a new Part 22 that's going to be added, and that will be effective July 22nd, July 24th.
And even reading this part of the final rule was pretty interesting how the FAA decided to place it as Part 22, how they made the decision on the number.
That's
It's
exactly right.
adjacent to 20, like, and like how it fit in the whole
Yeah,
framework of the overall picture. So, like, the fact
yeah,
that it's Part 22 is not like, oh, there's a gap in the numbers here. This works. That was a very deliberate choice to put it there
it
along
was.
with
So
other.
you read that in the preamble, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's why, I mean, so there were some arguments from some people that were saying, well, we don't want it to be called Part 22, and I can't remember what the arguments were, but they described why they felt that this was a perfect place for it. It fit into the regulations between 21 and 23. Obviously, the number, of course, but this was a sort of not meant to be, but it was meant to be for light sport aircraft in Part 22. And so, reading the preamble and why the FAA made this decision, I think these kinds of things are great. Now, again, not everybody's going to agree. I understand that, but I think it's really helpful to be able to read through this and see what the thinking was by the different people that are working on these kinds of regulations. So yeah, it's really
Yeah, these
interesting.
preambles are fascinating.
Yeah,
I
they are
mean,
fascinating. Yeah,
they're long, but it's worth it because like you said,
absolutely.
you get to see how the public's voice is incorporated into these rules and the logic of it all. So it's
One,
long, like you said, but if you read it in portions, it's really, I mean, kind of almost a fast read by time you get through.
yeah, yeah.
All of it, and it's all double spaced in that. So when we're saying it's, I mean, 700 and some odd pages is still a lot
Well,
double
right, right.
spaced,
It's
but
actually yes, yeah. It's also yeah. It's two columns, right,
yes, but it's not like you're reading, 700 pages of newspaper print or something like
right, right,
that.
right. Well,
It's
I will
based, but
say,
it is absolutely fascinating to see, and you can read all about this,
yeah,
rationale on something as what we would perceive, from the outside, perceive as something as simple as, well, they just stuck it in Part 22. Okay,
yeah, right,
that's
right,
a
right.
nice enough number.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and again, there are certain sections like I skipped over noise, quite frankly. Well, I looked it up the other day because there was a question about noise, but for the most part, I was like, nope. I mean, it's important. And I can promise you there are people looking at noise issues and all that kind of thing. And so all of the preamble information about noise was really important for that group, but not for me. So I was able to skip certain sections. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think that we sometimes take for granted the work that our, United States government and administration is doing. And yes, I know there's, always things that slow things down and frustrations for other things. So I'm not trying to say, the FAA is perfect by any means, but being able to look through this and get this type of regulation that helps us and be able to see how it's done, I think was just great. And I really do think a kudos and hats off to the FAA for getting this done. So obviously the big thing that came out of this was actually yelled out at the meeting when Sean Duffy was there at AirVenture. What was the stall speed? And the number they threw out was 61 knots. Now, Sean didn't know, he doesn't know about the regulations per se, I'm sure, but that's different than the sport pilot. So, and I know you guys have talked about it a little bit, but what this is saying is that any new Part 22 aircraft that are built can have a maximum stall speed of 61 knots calibrated airspeed in the landing configuration, VSO, so dirty. So this means your clean stall speed could be greater than that. It could be 65 knots or even higher. And that's a great thing because this means that this aircraft could be built in a way that would allow it to, fly faster and have more weight and things like that. So that was the first thing that was thrown out there. Now, I just want to say this part different, that sport pilots are now, like we talked about in the beginning, the FAA separated the division of the regulations for a sport pilot and the regulations for an aircraft. So now the sport pilot is limited by performance limitation because, by the way, I'll mention this in another slide. there is no Part 1.1 light sport aircraft definition for them to fly. There's now a light sport category, which is what these airplanes will be in. So a sport pilot can only fly an aircraft that has a stall speed clean of 59 knots. So that means if somebody builds a Part 22 light sport airplane whose stall speed is greater than 59 knots, then a sport pilot would not be able to fly it. A private pilot would be able to fly it.
Yeah, so I think that that's an interesting distinction. Yeah, with one being based on VSO and one being based on VS1, and that's all in on the preamble and on that discussion too. And that was interesting in itself. But just to understand, as pilots and operators out there, that difference does exist, and they are referencing different stall speeds,
Right.
and for
Well,
for those purposes.
again, I think it was so when we talked to the FAA guy who was at our meeting. Again, what they really wanted to do is they wanted to get away from tying a sport pilot to a specific aircraft. So that was part of the problem. So they're going to take away the definition, right? So now we're creating these new Part 22 light sport category airplanes. But a number of people who were looking at the stall speeds and load factors and weight limits and all that for a new Part 22 aircraft said, well, if this airplane can fly faster and carry more weight and things like that, what do we do about sport pilots? And the FAA said, look, the safety continuum for sport pilots and light sport aircraft shows that sport pilots are safer than general aviation. Now, not by a lot, but they are a tiny bit safer. And we want to continue that safety continuum by keeping that safety continuum so that sport pilots are safer shows that they can have these privileges to be able to fly faster airplanes. But they can't be flying something that, its clean stall speed is 75 knots, for example, because that airplane is going to be perhaps a little bit harder to control than one that's a little bit slower. So by limiting the sport pilot to the 59 knots clean, it helps keep that safety continuum for sport pilots. So yeah, it's really interesting. And the preamble again describes all of this and what their thinking was. So maximum weight limit for a new Part 22 airplane is going to be 3,000 pounds. Maximum airspeed. So this is one that's still being kind of looked at. We don't know what they mean by maximum airspeed, whether they mean maximum cruise speed or maximum never exceed speed. And so I believe this question is being sent back by EAA and AOPA and others to try to determine what specifically are we talking about with 250 knots here. So we all think it's kind of cruise speed is what they're talking about. So just trying to define this a little bit better, but that's still fast for most of these types of airplanes. Maximum seats of 4. So again, this is another kind of a mentally split issue, if you will. For example, a sport pilot could fly a an airplane that has 4 seats, but again, the stall speed clean has to be 59 knots. So for example, a Cessna 172, which has 4 seats. The new Part 22 airplanes will also have 4 seats. Now, a sport pilot can only take 1 passenger. So that's their limitation and has always been their limitation and stays as is. But for these Part 22 light sport airplanes, they could have 4 seats, and now a private pilot could fly in one of these Part 22 light sport airplanes and carry 3 passengers and themselves. Options that were included now, of course, are retractable landing gear,
Mhm.
adjustable propellers, so like a constant speed prop, multi-engines. Part of this, quite frankly, is the drawing of the having aircraft, the vertical takeoff and landing that have like multi engines, like have 8 engines on them. So you can't really limit the multi engine thing that, if you're going to use those types of aircraft. But
Mhm.
having twin engine light sport aircraft is a big plus. I know Phil Lockwood's got his air cams and things that have that.
Yeah,
Electric
and then
engines.
oh yeah, I was gonna say, and the other thing to keep in mind here, like you said, these are airplane specific. So with those things like those 4 seats, airplanes will be allowed to have that, but that's the only one. Any
That is
other
correct.
type of light sport aircraft certificated here under Part 22 will be, or for that light sport pilots will be able to operate rather, are still
Yeah.
limited to 2 seats.
Yeah. Well, right. I'm the task group leader for weight shift control. I've flown trikes or weight shift control. Um, so for example, we are updating the current light sport aircraft weight shift control standard to do a number of other things. However, its stall speed is still going to stay at 45 knots, and it will not have a 3 or 4 seat weight shift control, although there's been some requests for that, believe it or not. But so most of those, like powered parachute, weight shift control, gyroplanes, helicopters, and the vertical takeoff and landing, are going to be 2 seats only, with the stall speeds being 45 knots. Although I don't know, for the vertical takeoff and landing is a different animal. But yes, that's exactly right. This is airplane centric. Electric engines. This has been, a huge. This is part of the push for this is that we have a number of airplanes out there that are starting to run electric engines, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. And turbine engines, and this is another factor that there's no reason why you couldn't have a turbine engine on a light sport aircraft, as long as you would be able to, control it and keep it within the 250 knots and things like that. So actually, at AirVenture, I think JMV had a turbine style JMV VL3 light sport out there that they were advertising as Part 23 right now, though. One of the things that's occurring, of course, is that this means that people using their driver's license can fly, their 172 or something like that. Um, and I've had people already comment, other CFIs say, "Oh my goodness, this is a terrible thing because now people are going to fall out of the sky because they're not getting a medical." And that's not true. And it's the same argument that was brought up when the 2004 light sport rule came into play. In fact, it will be safer because if somebody really wants to let their medical lapse and then they don't want to use basic med and they only want to use their driver's license, then they have to fly as sport pilot with limitations, i.e., they can't fly at night, they can't go above 10,000 feet, they can only take one passenger. So they're actually going to be safer than people that are not, that have a third class medical and are
Right, and the
flying.
NTSB database shows
It
people
does.
don't st- even people even medical certificate holders. If you're gonna cheat the system, you're gonna cheat the system.
That's right. There's always bad actors, and people with third class medicals have issues and crash. And in fact,
Hmm.
the FAA said this, that um, there's never been a sport pilot fatalities in a light sport aircraft. There have been 2 private pilot fatalities in light sport aircraft, but that was it. All right, the maintenance changes real quick. So what they kept the light sport repairman certificate, which was great. What they added is that now a light sport repairman mechanic like myself can work on light sport category aircraft. This would be same class and category. So another airplane, single engine land. I can't work on a helicopter, for example, or a seaplane. But the other thing they added is I can work on any experimental amateur build that's in the category and class. I'm not interested in doing that, but people that are light sport repairman mechanics are very excited about this because now they can start working and do a condition inspection on experimental amateur build. But more exciting was this light sport repairman inspection. So the light sport repairman mechanic certificate is a 16-day course that you go to. The light sport repairman inspection allows you to work on your own experimental amateur build. And the reason why this got applause is that currently the way it exists, if you buy an experimental amateur built airplane, the only way you can get a condition inspection is either through an A&P or the builder. Now, with the new rule, if you go to a 16-hour course, basically a 2-day course, you can do your own condition inspection on it. So a lot of the experimental amateur group is very excited about that.
Hmm.
Not covered was noise reduction, simplified flight controls, and helicopters. All right, so let me talk about ASTM and the consensus standards. So again, the new Part 22 aircraft that are coming out, the FAA has said that we will accept the standards of the ASTM. I want to point out that there are a number of standards that are used for all different types of things, including aircraft. There's a committee called the F40, which works with the Part 23 certification, and they use standards like SAE, Radio Technical Commission of Aeronautics, Joint Aviation Requirements. So there's all of these different types of standards. We're not the only one out there, but
Hmm.
it's one that's been around a long time, has a long history, and you'll see ASTM used for like computers and for, how to do lawn care. I mean, they're all over everything. Also, the standards that get accepted by the FAA usually will get accepted by the other civil aviation authorities. For example, Transport Canada has a bilateral agreement with the FAA. So if the FAA accepts our standards, then more than likely the Transport Canada group will accept it. EASA, of course, wants to see what we're doing, Brazil, and then there's others, New Zealand and Australia. So the ASTM F-37 committee, so there's a number of numbered committees from one to, I think, how many there are in there, like 300, but again, committees for different kinds of things. So the idea is to develop these consensus standards that, design and performance and all of this. We in the ASTM committees are strongly supporting and really pushing safety and innovation. It's a little bit of a misnomer, I suppose, to say that, manufacturers just want to get something out that's going to allow them to sell to the market. So having all of the gee whiz wheels and whistles and bangs and things like that is great, but we also are tasked. Our current chairman, Ryan Johnson, the vice president of Vans, has said over and over when he originally talked to the FAA, Lothario, I think was his name, who was the administrator some years ago. He said, we want safer airplanes and we want the consensus standards to be safer than the current standards that we have, even at a Part 23 level. So we are very focused on that. And that's why I want to emphasize that whatever new aircraft come out, safety is one of the things that we're always talking about. Now, this is our current time frame that for accepting the standards. I'm not going to go into this too much, but basically we have to get. We're going to vote. I'll show the process here. We're going to vote on each of these standards. They have to go through committees, through a subcommittee and a full committee, and then they're going to go to the FAA, and then the FAA is going to look at them and come back and forth. Now we have FAA in our committee, so they're telling us no, we agree, or maybe, or whatever. But there'll be some point where they'll take the standard, put it through the FAA, and then they'll kick it back to us, and they'll either reject some items, accept some items, and then we'll go through and we'll be done. But that means that basically we have until about April to submit them to the FAA before we get to July 24th. Committee members are manufacturers like Hartzell's there, and we have Dynan is represented, and Garmin's there. We have Vans is there, Rands is there, a lot of different manufacturing companies, pilots like myself, maintenance professionals like myself, Brian and Carol Carpenter from Rainbow Aviation. And then we have regulators, the government, the FAA is on there. We have usually the NAC is on there with the Brazilian people, MIASA. So we have people from all over the world, and we do these by Zoom meetings. And typically it's like one meeting a week and multiple task group meetings. Academia, general interest, international for sure, general interest, and you. And this is my little pitch for anybody who's looking at this podcast, Sarah. Please join us. We need the input. We want the input. You're welcome to, contact me or just go to ASTM and find out about it. You will have what's called a voting interest. So the public is entirely welcome to any of the meetings that we have. There's nothing secret about it. And we have Google Drives that have all of our information. However, you cannot vote unless you're a member of ASTM. And I think the default membership is like $120 a year subscription. And then you can have producer membership and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't change your vote. But voting members can vote on the ballots of the standards. If you're not a voting member, you can have input, but if you can't vote, then it won't count for the ballot. Any questions about this so far, Sarah?
No, this looks great. I really appreciate you sharing how people could get involved in ASTM because I didn't know that that was, kind of a
That's
fairly public process. I thought that was, being ignorant, I was
so
kind of like, well, that sounds like it's probably like engineers and everybody behind closed doors figuring out what works. I didn't realize it was so
it is
transparent.
engineers, and they may be in their office with closed doors because engineers don't want to come out and talk to people. No, I'm just
I'm
kidding.
married to one.
All you
I get it.
engineers out there, yeah, yeah. But no, it's and I thought that too. But it is entirely open to the public, like the Google Drive and all of the documentation that we're writing and things like that. You won't have edit access, obviously, unless you're a voting member. But yeah, and so it's totally open for the public to look at and make comments about because, and again, there is public interest for certain areas. For example, weight shift control. We have a number of people that are interested, but they don't want to be voting members. They just want to give their input, and it's very good input, but they're not necessarily that vested changing it or whatever. Now the manufacturers are, and the engineers are, and people like myself, and I think one of the areas that I believe is most lacking for ASTM is CFIs, instructors. So that's why Samantha got involved and myself as well. Because when it comes to the pilot operating handbook and the flight supplements and teaching and training, there's not as great a representation in the groups. And then so when we get into a subject, for example, I'm the task group lead of IFR into IMC, which is the idea of having Part 22 aircraft that are instrument flight rules into IMC. So we'll have lots of discussions about heated pitot tubes and autopilot. And Sam and I will bring up why we think it's important to have a certain kind of training, why the POH might need to specify something. So a lot of that interest is a little bit missing. It's usually, again, it's a lot of manufacturers and designers and engineers and things like that. So the subcommittees are broken up into what's called the scoping. So it's the scoping of all of the light sport. The functional content is the majority of the task groups. And this is going to be power plant, propulsion, which is going to have electric, reciprocating engines, turbine engines, continued operation. We have maintenance. So we're putting some maintenance ballast through, weight shift control, powered parachute. All of these task groups are working on either existing standards or new standards for the new Part 22 rule. I think there's like 44 different task groups, and I'm the task group lead of IFR and IMC and weight shift control. And then aircraft integration is essentially what that's going to be is there will be a integration standard that's written that's sort of like a recipe, if you will, that if a manufacturer accepts that integration standard, then all of the things that are behind it, like power plant and propulsion and occupant safety and continued operational safety, will all be part of that integration. They're accepting all of those standards. And what we're hoping, and the FAA has agreed to, we're all excited about this, is that all the FAA will have to do is look at the aircraft integration standards and say, yep, this covers everything that we think will be safe for the public, and they'll accept that consensus. So that's what our plan of action is. The process, if you will, is we can either build on existing standards or we can create a new standard. We do have like templates that show how the standard has to be a certain way it has to be written. The meetings, almost all of them are by Zoom. We do have a in-place meeting 4 times a year, so people can attend that if they want to. The next meeting is going to be in Atlanta in October, and so it's open to the public. But in-house meetings are good because they have to have in-house, and you have to have a quorum and all that kind of thing. And we write the standards or point to existing standards. We ballot to the subcommittee, so usually all these subcommittee task groups like the IFR, IMC, and then we ballot to that subcommittee. Then it comes back. And if there are any negatives, they must be what's called dispositioned, which means that the ballot doesn't pass. So this is what consensus means. There has to be a consensus, an agreement to whatever the standard is. So if the standard comes back with a negative, somebody says, I don't like this, or I want this change or whatever, then it comes back to the subcommittee and then we address it. Now, the way to address it is either we rewrite the standard and then send out a revote on that standard. That's one way to do it. Or we can do what's called disposition. We can either talk to the person involved and see why they put the negative in. Sometimes they'll withdraw if we say, well, we'll fix this in the next ballot, or this is why it's like that. Or if we find it what's called non-persuasive, meaning that the majority of the committee doesn't think it's an issue and they don't want to deal with that. So then the consensus is we vote against that negative, and then that's the way the standard goes forward. So this is how we kind of go through the process. I think that was it as far as how the process works. So
That's an amazing amount of detail. And so,
yeah,
I think just for the average flight instructor, in nothing in our training or flight instructor education talks about this.
Hmm.
When we just hear things like, oh, there's the light sport airplane standard, it's kind of,
Yeah.
okay, they exist. I don't think anybody thinks that deep on how they got there and
Well,
realize it is this detailed.
so here's the thing. So you all, as commercial certified flight instructors, you know very well about the rules for if as it is an airplane airworthy, whether the airplane's airworthiness certificates, the transponder check, all of that kind of stuff, right? And we know all that, but you never think about a standard type certificated aircraft. How did that Cessna 172 come about? And so it was all done between the government and the manufacturer. I use the example of it took something like 20 years for that standard type certificated aircraft to get built. By doing this consensus standard, it's a much quicker process. However, we're not shortchanging anything because if somebody says, I think safety is important, then that has to be agreed upon in the standard or voted non negative, all that kind of thing, right? So, yeah, this is some of the background information. And again, I would encourage people to join and check it out. And I think they'd be
Hmm.
interested to see what the new Part 22 aircraft is going to look like.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I'm glad you shared that with us because I didn't have a clue, and so I would imagine most of our listeners aren't familiar with this either. As day to day flight instructors, this is kind of, I don't want to say off in the weeds, but certainly
Yeah.
outside, of our periphery vision.
Yeah.
And it's like I say, so much what we do for operating as pilots. The certificate's either there or it's not,
Yeah.
and how
Absolutely.
that even got there in the first place is
Well, and I do a presentation on the history of light sport and sport pilot, which sort of explains how we got to where we are today. But again, most people don't know this, but the original light sport aircraft, those were all built by consensus standard. So the definition and all of that was by consensus. Because
oh, interesting.
when the first rule came out, the manufacturers of light sport back then, what we call fat ultralights, Quicksilver, et cetera, said, we don't want to go through a Part 23 certification, a standard type certificate. So the FAA said, okay, well, let's use the ASTM standard model. So that's what they started doing. And all light sport aircraft are ASTM consensus standard built currently. And so moving
Yeah,
forward, though, this
I
is an
knew that they
agreement.
were standard. They were built to a standard. It wasn't a defined part. Obviously we're just now getting to that with Part 22, but it had never
Right.
really occurred to me what the genesis of those standards
Yep.
was and how involved and detailed of a process and system that
Oh, yeah.
actually is.
Well, and just, like I said before in the there, this is just an example of consensus standards. I mean, there's so many standard groups out there. And if you were to look at so if you join ASTM, you can join what's called the F44 committee. That's certified airplanes. So again, Cessna 172s or whatever, Chucky 180. And in there, they are using like the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics standard for radios. So we've been using consistent standards for other airplanes for a long time. But really, this is where the FAA is moving forward with this idea of consensus standards for newer aircraft so that we can have aircraft come out to market that would be useful for the public and compete with the other aircraft, of course. But yeah, be able to get a lot more aircraft out there that the public can use and play around and have fun with. I mean, it's going to be great. We're looking at a really change in history with aviation, I think.
All right. Well, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time and all you do to support NAFI and our interests in this process and taking the time to share this information with our members.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And of course, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to email me or call me or whatever. So,
All right, fabulous. Thank you so much, Bill.
thanks, Sarah. Bye bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe. You can get this podcast in video version on YouTube, or you can get the audio version anywhere you get your podcasts. New and returning NAFI members can save $5 on their annual membership by using the code PODSAVE5, PODSAVE 5, the numeral, at our website, nafimentor.org.